Thank you so much. I am really excited to be here today. Great. And first, I want to thank the Access Conference Planning Committee. The sort of reputation of this conference precedes you. I have many colleagues back in the States who love this conference as well. And I'm just so thrilled to be here today to share some of my experiences with you all, and most importantly, to learn from you. I've already found this morning to be very edifying. Also, the city is beautiful. So I'm going to talk about data security, which is sort of a counterpart or partner to privacy. And I want to start with a bit of context about my institution, myself, and this project. I'm a libraries fellow at North Carolina State University, which is a large land-grant institution in Raleigh, North Carolina. And for those of you who may not know, a land-grant institution is a government-sponsored public college or university that's traditionally focused on agriculture, engineering, and other sciences. I grew up in Idaho, but unlike my institution, I have an academic background in liberal arts, specifically in film and media studies. My professional interests are vast, but sort of center around the many facets of data literacy. And I joined the NCSU Libraries as a fellow in June of 2016. As a fellow, I work in 2 departments on a variety of projects. So for the first year, I worked with Lynema, whose name you see on the program in the slides. She could not be here today. She's the associate head of the library's IT department, and she proposed a strategic initiative entitled Effective Stewardship of Library Data, which is the topic of this presentation. I have to just give a thank you to Emily. Her mentorship and guidance through this process has been really, really beneficial. So the main focus of this project was to conduct an internal audit to ensure that our systems are compliant with institutional guidelines and government regulations on data and cybersecurity. So this presentation will cover our motivations, our process, outcomes, and next steps for this project. So to begin, our motivations were twofold. It's in response to growing concern over cybersecurity and to prepare for the potential need for future data collection. Firstly, it is no surprise to everyone in this room and everyone watching that data and cybersecurity are of primary concern to many institutions. These issues permeate throughout the spectrum of businesses, governments, institutions of higher education, and individuals. Really, not a week goes by without some news of a new data breach. So the reality and financial impact of these breaches led my campus, among many others, to prioritize cybersecurity. So there's this entire legal and regulatory landscape that sort of shaped this project. In the US, there are a number of federal and state statutes that protect personally identifiable information, student records, health records, and even library records. So you may have heard of some of these examples. One is called FERPA, which stands for the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act and protects student data, and HIPAA, which is sort of, it's a Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act that protects personal health information. Those are just 2 examples of many of these regulations. So at NC State, the regulations are interpreted through guidelines that are entitled the Data Sensitivity Framework. This was developed by our Central Office of Information Technology. The framework assigns sensitivity levels to data elements and prescribes appropriate controls based on the assigned sensitivity. There are 4 levels: purple for ultra-sensitive, red, highly sensitive, yellow, moderately sensitive, and green for not sensitive or normal data. So an example of this is credit card numbers, bank account numbers, and social security numbers are classified as purple data. Purple data cannot be transmitted over email, stored on an individual hard drive, or stored anywhere without the approval of the data steward. This institutional framework served as a foundation and scaffolding for this whole project. So our Central Office of Information Technology really did a lot of the legwork for us. To address our second motivation, as our previous presenter just went over, library professionals are historic champions of privacy, but privacy does not equate security. They're connected, but they're not the same. Privacy in libraries has traditionally been focused on maintaining reader confidentiality through obscuring and purging circulation records. But the 21st century library generates and collects all kinds of data, from easy proxy logs to card swipes to room reservations and online chat transcripts. The list goes on. And these systems that collect data about our users will continue to abound, especially as higher education institutions and other institutions begin to engage with big data analytics to both improve and prove the value of libraries to students and other users. So our project aimed to answer two fundamental yet complex questions. One, what data do we have? And two, where is that data? So to answer these questions, we conducted an internal data audit, generated a data inventory, and assessed our practices based on our institutional data sensitivity framework. As a newly minted librarian, I desired a guiding document to help me approach this large undertaking, and I recognized the need to have a structured approach to this project. I thought up a number of methods, including surveys, questionnaires, or town hall meetings, but I was looking for examples from other libraries or organizations in hopes to identify and model similar projects. I had some trouble finding anything specifically on data security and libraries. I found plenty of papers published on privacy, data stewardship in terms of data preservation, and research data management. There are also papers published on the need to protect personally identifiable information in higher education, but no practical approaches to doing so. But I did find some helpful documents on the data audit or the data asset framework that was developed by the Humanities Advanced Technology and Information Institute at the University of Glasgow. This framework provides organizations with the means to identify, locate, describe, and assess how they are managing their research data assets. And while this methodology is focused on research data, I had no trouble adapting it to my own security audit. This method recommends hiring or assigning an auditor who will conduct the following 4 stages. 1, planning the audit. 2, identifying and classifying the data assets. 3, assessing the management of those assets. And 4, reporting findings and recommending change. So in hindsight, this approach is common sense and these stages seem very simple. But at the beginning of this process, I found this roadmap to be incredibly helpful and insightful. So I dove in and I assigned myself as the role of auditor. I took the first step to plan and scope the audit. We were most interested in data elements that are considered sensitive according to our campus framework, remember those 4 colors, which is primarily PII and student data. We were also interested in data that is considered sensitive to libraries, like circulation transactions. I began by reviewing internal documentation and scheduled interviews with representatives from each of the departments. From the information gathered in those interviews, I generated a data inventory and assessed it based on the campus framework. I then created training for staff and made recommendations for policy updates. For the information gathering or identifying stage, I decided to have in-person interviews as opposed to administering a questionnaire or survey. This was time-consuming, as I held over 22 discussions that were each an hour long. But this decision was based primarily on our workplace culture and the fact that interviews are often more effective information-gathering tools than surveys. However, I preceded each discussion with a list of thought-provoking questions regarding the data that my colleagues encounter. These interviews were an hour long with occasional follow-up messages and discussions as needed. And I began each meeting with a short overview of the goals and of our project, and then invited my colleagues to share their thoughts and begin the discussion where they were most comfortable. All of the interviewees were very open and willing and excited to participate in this conversation. And each discussion proceeded, I took notes and asked guiding questions. And these interviews were loosely structured, which often led to further discovery. For example, the head of program planning and outreach asked me whether I would include photographs and videos as library data. And prior to that meeting, I had not even considered photographs and videos and wasn't even aware that we housed so many in the library. These discussions also revealed a ubiquitous desire for standard practices and guidelines when dealing with sensitive data, or any data for that matter. The practices for storing, sharing, and saving our data vary across and within departments. For example, all of the departments that employ student workers maintain lists that contain student names, email addresses, student IDs, phone numbers, pictures, and sometimes evaluation comments. And the granularity and storage location of these lists are inconsistent across the departments. So while these differences do not necessarily reflect poor data security, it did reveal areas for improvement within our organization. Based on the interviews, I generated a data inventory. And prior to gathering the information, I sort of designed a spreadsheet in anticipation of what I thought I would find, but quickly had to adapt it to reflect the existing framework. So you can see the fields listed on this slide. And this inventory is by no means comprehensive because of our scope. So we're focused on PII and other sensitive data, which means that certain data sources are not represented. The inventory is organized by data source and lists the elements, storage location, and any retention policies and other notes. I encountered some challenges along the way, particularly with my definition and scope of a data source. Through this process, I recognized that a source can be anything from an individual email or spreadsheet to our entire ILS. It was difficult to reduce some of our more complicated applications to their basic data elements. We're also focused on internally hosted sources, but some of those internally hosted applications pull data from external sources. And we also rely on vendors to host and feed data back to us. So describing the data sources and their elements was not always as clear and easy as I would have hoped. And I often kind of became overwhelmed by the amount and variety of the data. But having that clear scope and framework at the beginning was very important to the progress of this project. I continually returned back to the framework and plan that I had set out at the beginning. So as I completed the inventory, I assigned the sensitivity levels that were defined by our internal data framework. Through this process, I found that most of the data in the libraries is yellow or moderately sensitive, and that graphic kind of shows the comparison between the amounts of yellow, green, and red data. We also identified instances of purple data and red data that were no longer necessary to our organization and removed them. Overall, I am happy to say that our storage, sharing, and retention practices are compliant with institutional guidelines and, by extension, legal regulations. However, library circulation transactions and other usage data are not classified by our campus framework. So our most sacred data is not yet considered sensitive to our campus. We are now making recommendations to internally classify our data elements that include but are not limited to circulation transactions, e-resource usage, space and technology use, reference, chat. The list goes on, and in developing these recommendations, we've engaged in very interesting conversations with our colleagues, both within our organization and at other libraries, regarding the need to expand our collective definition of what counts as library data and which of that data should be protected. After completing the inventory and interviews, I developed and offered training for staff on how to handle sensitive data. The training covered the sensitivity levels defined by our internal framework and used relatable examples from our everyday work. The training materials are now available through our staff intranet. We are also in the process of recommending policy updates that reflect our compliance and commitment to security as well as privacy. This is an important step for us because I think we can be leaders in sort of the transparency of the data that we collect and how it's used. And finally, we're exploring models for ongoing maintenance of the inventory and data governance. In closing, this project was very valuable to our organization. A few of those outcomes include increased awareness about cybersecurity amongst staff, which empowers them to make informed decisions about the data that they interact with. Many of the interviews revealed that individuals were sort of insecure about their security practices. So this project facilitated the space and time to talk about best practices. As an organization, it is also incredibly beneficial for us to be compliant with our campus guidelines. And near the end of the information gathering and assessment stages, I contacted the head of our compliance office to let them know about the project. Needless to say, they were thrilled that we had taken this upon ourselves. And finally, we are better positioned to make informed decisions regarding data collection in the future. Having this foundational awareness of what data we generate, collect, and store, and for what purpose, will assist us as we consider new projects and services. And with that, I'd like to thank you and open it up for any questions. Anybody?
I'm just wondering if you, other than contacting you directly, do you have all your questionnaires and that kind of stuff available publicly?
I do not, but that is something to consider for the future. And you can contact me directly and I'd share everything.
Oh, sorry. Did you forgive me for asking something if you said this because I didn't catch it, but if you did, just tell me I missed it. In your survey work, looking at the data that you had in the organization, did you classify the sort of the working files of staff? In other words, the files that go back and forth that are personnel related? Because if I heard you correctly, it's mostly about user data, sort of statistical data or transactional data. But I'm curious about sort of the traffic and information between staff that doesn't have anything to do with users.
Right, that's a great question. So we were focused on user data, but users included staff and things that happen sort of outside of library transactions. And those most of those data elements are classified by that internal framework. And so we did cover that. So things like spreadsheets that go between members of our personnel department, we addressed those, included them in the inventory, and also included that in the training, that those should perhaps not be emailed directly, but should go through a shared drive or through a more secure form of transmission. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. I guess I'm interested in sort of, I often find it interesting that we talk a lot in libraries. Sort of there's an agenda here, which is we talk a lot about user privacy, but we have a very different set of rules that we apply to our own work, and sometimes that's an okay thing, and other times it's a bit of a blind spot for libraries. But it sounds like in your case it was not.
Well, and it wasn't because we sort of the library user focus was our focus. Our campus doesn't necessarily have that as a focus. So we had all of that. We had that entire framework of data elements that are sort of outside of the library that we were considering in that process.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks.
I'm curious. I used to work at NC State.
Yay!
I'm curious in the age where the default is often to collect as much as possible, so that we can, because we never know what we might need.
Yep.
If you received any pushback at all on the recommendations to cut certain types of data from collection.
So that's a really great question, and we didn't cut data that wasn't in use, and that's not to say that we use all of our data. We only removed instances of the ultra and highly sensitive data that were no longer useful for our organization. We didn't get a lot of pushback because this is an important topic, and this framework, this audit allows us to be more intentional about our data collection. So we weren't saying we can't collect this data. We're saying we need to know that we're collecting this data so that it is secure, so it's stored on an encrypted server instead of on, someone's hard drive. Yeah. Anything else? Thank you.